Well, Tom, having read your book, I mean, one hell of a life. When were you first in Jaipur?
I was first here in 1972. I figured that out 54 years ago. I was a little boy.
Yeah, and
No, I was a young traveler, but I stayed for 8 years. So.
wow. Well, we talked about, I mean, the introduction doesn't do justice to your life because you, perhaps one of the most important media figures globally, I would say. But people actually don't realize that you had a first life many, many years before you embarked on your MTV adventure. I want to know more about the pre-MTV Tom Freston. What led you to do what you did in India and Afghanistan? How you started off that whole journey from sort of a middle-class life in Connecticut all the way to Delhi and Kabul?
Well, I'll try and do that quickly. But I was brought up in a suburb of New York City. It was like the heart of conformity, and I did all I can to escape from that. I really never went anywhere. And I I went to graduate school, I got a business degree. I sort of bartended my way around. I worked in an ad agency. A woman called me and said, you know, you shouldn't be doing that. I was currently on a toilet paper account. Quit and come with me. We're going to cross the Sahara Desert. So a week later, I was on a plane. I had quit. That was a really important decision in my life. And we went across the Sahara Desert. And then we spent 2 months together, and I continued and ended up hitchhiking all over Europe and through Asia, and then fell in love with Afghanistan and India. The minute I entered Afghanistan, I thought I'd been lost and found. It was the beginning of a new era in my life, and I decided I wanted to stay there. But you couldn't really get a job in those days. India was like walking into a blowtorch in 1972. It was still a brand new nation. It was only 25 years old, and it was in its sort of constipated, bureaucratic state trying to find its way. It's far cry from today, but it was really an assault on all your senses, and I loved it. I felt really alive here, and I started a business, did that for about 8 years, and then through a series of unfortunate events in Afghanistan, the Russians invaded Afghanistan. I had to close that down. I came here, and then there was an embargo. There was tariffs in America on Indian clothing, something similar that's happening today. And my business went under, and I started a media career and joined a company that would go on to begin and start MTV.
Not so fast, Tom. I want to get back to the toilet paper account. There's a whole section about different types of toilet paper users in the book, which I urge you to read.
When I read that report, that was sort of the end of that was a line I couldn't cross.
Can you just briefly mention the...
Yeah. Well, Procter & Gamble, you all know Procter & Gamble, big on consumer research. They divided America into 3 categories of toilet paper users. Rollers, folders, and crumplers.
We'd like to raise your hands for the 3 categories.
I sense there's some crumplers here. Crumplers turned out to be the heavy users. And crumplers lived in cities. So the advertising was really directed to the crumpler contingent. And they had a guy named Mr. Whipple who was in these corny commercials. But that was a line I really couldn't cross. And that led me to a whole new chapter in my life. But if anyone wants to know anything about toilet paper, well, I'm your man.
Well, after the event, we can answer some questions. But describe India, you know, only 25 years old in the 1970s. Describe that India to me. You know, we've talked about the Imperial Hotel, what it looked like, the sorts of characters that lived in India, the expats.
Well, it's so remarkably different than it is today, which is basically like half a century later. I mean, sort of finding its way. There was really only one kind of car. A lot of you know this. There was just the ambassador car. There was no television. There was very little media. The poverty was extensive. 60% of the population was under the poverty line. That number today is like 4%, so just imagine the change. The population was only 550 million, which I thought was incredible. Now it's more than double that. And there was a wild group of Westerners were here. You really couldn't get a job in India those days as a Westerner. You either had to be here on some kind of spiritual search, which was a lot of people were doing, or in the diplomatic corps, or you were here as a student.
Or in drugs.
Or you were a smuggler. There was a lot of smuggling going on. There was a whole set of people who deal with royal family members who were trying to get antiques out of the country, or they were smuggling drugs. And so you ran into a lot of interesting people.
Tell us about the guy who showed up with something in his car and needed help.
The man who showed...
With the dead body.
Oh. Well, that's not a great story, but one day someone came to I had a house in Greater Kailash Part 2. It was one of the only houses there then. It was a brand new suburb. This is in New Delhi, and a fellow I knew pulled in, and there was a dead body in the back seat of a taxi. And the taxi driver wanted to unload the body in our driveway because he didn't want to be driving it around anymore. It was a foreigner who was a friend who had had an overdose of heroin.
Yeah.
And I didn't even know the guy was a user, but eventually no hospital would accept the body.
Yeah, but people get the wrong impression about what you were doing in India. Describe the business, Hindu Kush.
Well, the idea was we would, I got into the garment business. We would design and make clothing and export it to New York, and we would sell it to stores, better stores. I mean, my idea was we would do higher quality contemporary clothes, not the sort of cheap, lower margin, run-of-the-mill clothing, and we had built a wonderful business. We also would sell in Canada and the Netherlands, and we became, much to my surprise, very successful. But it was, of all the things I've done in my life, it was the hardest work I've ever done. There was always something going wrong. I was sort of the manager of the supply chain, but...
How big was, I mean, in terms of turnover, how big was the business?
Sometimes we would grow, like our growth would be every year. Now, these were in 1972 US dollars, a couple $1 million a year. We could be year after year growing at that type of level. So it was not an insignificant business. But I didn't want to really be a huge garment player. I was really living in India because I wanted the sense of adventure. I wanted to learn. I wanted to travel. I think I traveled to there was only 14 states then. I think I hit every one of them. So that was my main goal. But over and over, as the business grew, the business took up more and more of my time. And then eventually, the little empire we had created was just destroyed by Jimmy Carter and his tariff program. So I came back to New York 8 years later, my tail between my legs, having built an empire and lost it, but certainly enjoyed it all along the way.
And tell us a little about Afghanistan, which was a very different Afghanistan to today. And you had this Delhi, Kabul presence, and you were spending half your time, I assume, in Delhi and half your time in Kabul.
Yeah, Afghanistan was like a marvelous place. It was beautiful, it was rugged, there was hardly any trace of modernity. It was a place where I arrived at the tail end of what old-timers now would call the golden age. Most people think of Afghanistan today as a country that's been continually at war, which it has been really since the late 70s, a series of wars. It's unfortunate. The people were warm, they were hospitable, you could go anywhere, and it was, their tourist poster said, for the few tourists that came, visit Afghanistan and see the world's friendliest people, which would be the last thing on anybody's mind today. But that, if anyone lived there, then they would agree with that premise.
Yeah, true. So you returned to New York, you're in your mid-30s, the tariffs have destroyed your business, you must feel very dejected and defeated. So what happened? What led you to MTV, and why the music business?
Well, I had ended up here because I love to travel, and I love cultures in Asia and Africa. And when I got back to New York, deep in debt, I found this book. It was the only self-help book I ever bought in my life. It was called What Color is Your Parachute? Some of you might know of it, but this was the first edition. Its premise basically was, well, you can do any number of things in life. You have skills that you've developed that are transferable, but a key thing is to do something that you love. And they had all these exercises that would take you through, and you could determine what was this thing that I loved. And in my case, it turned out to be music, rock and roll music. That was a thing I had a huge passion for, huge knowledge about. So I went about looking for a job in that business. I thinking, how can I get in on that? I saw an interview in a trade magazine about a fellow who said, we're going to start a video music channel. And that sounded like a great idea to me. I was familiar with music videos. Most Americans did not know anything about them. And through my brother and a connection, I got an interview, and they sort of hired me on the spot. They said, we're looking for people with no experience in television. I said, I'm your man. I'm your guy. I didn't even have television where I've been living the last 8 years. So they hired me, and lo and behold, I was on a development team of about 6 or 7 people to develop a concept that would become MTV. And after a few years, I became the president of this company. And I got to say, it was a company with a real irregular group of employees. We probably were the worst dressed group of people going in and out of any New York office building. And we had a great idea. I thought this was one of the greatest ideas in the world. The problem was selling it to the cable companies, which wasn't a lot of cable at the time. Our advertisers said no one's going to watch music on television. Music companies didn't want to give us the music videos, but we started nonetheless. And we basically fought our battles. Everybody, we had to turn all the no's into yeses. And we ultimately took it totally around the world.
But one of the big campaigns that was your campaign was I Want My MTV. That was transformative for the business because it was touch and go prior to that. Tell us a little more about that campaign.
That was a campaign born of desperation. We were running out of money. We were about to be closed down. We knew none of these business areas wanted anything to do with this, but we did know one thing. In the very few places where we existed, young adults were crazy about MTV. They just thought, it's hard to imagine now, but it was seen as really revolutionary then. They had a visual style no one had seen before. So we decided we would spend our last nickels advertising to these people and see if we could get them to drive distribution. It was like, screw the cable operators, let's turn our fans loose, our potential fans loose. So we would get rock stars, we would enlist rock stars to say, I want my MTV. They would hold our logo, and we would run ads market by market, and without fail, every different cable operator, who were all little monopolists, after about 3 weeks would raise a white flag and add us.
How did you convince David Bowie?
I called David Bowie's manager, and I said, we'd like him to do this campaign. And I had met David Bowie briefly before. He was the first person who even let us use his photographs. And he said to me, is this good? I said, we're going to put music in people's home 24 hours a day. So he said, okay, you can use my photographs. So then I went to his manager about a year and a half later, and I said, we have this ad campaign. We'd love David to do it. And she called me back and said, David would love to do it, but he's skiing. He's in Stade, Switzerland. So if you want to go all the way over to Switzerland, you can shoot him for your commercials.
No guarantees, though.
No guarantees. So I got on a plane with a 35 millimeter crew. We took a train from Zurich to Stade, and we set up at the bottom of a little hill. David was in great shape. He was in his sort of let's dance phase, blonde, slim, smart. He was very pleasant. He did 3 or 4, 5 or 6 runs. We shot it. He knew exactly what he wanted to do. And then he said, hey, anyone want to go skiing? The day was young. And so went skiing. Interesting man. And then he said, well, what are you doing tonight, Tom? I'm staying basically like in a youth hostel. He said, well, why don't you come to the Palace Hotel, which was the Grand Dame Hotel. We'll go to the spa and we can take a sauna. I said, I couldn't believe this. I said, sure. He was like one of, the Beatles and David Bowie were like the 2 people in my personal pantheon. So I went back to our little hotel and I said to our rest of the crew, I'll see you losers later. I'm going down to take a sauna with David Bowie, if you can believe it. So I meet him. I go into the spa, put a towel on. We go into the sauna.
I thought you're not allowed to put towels on in Switzerland.
Well, we had towels on.
Okay.
I don't know.
You sure? Okay.
It was very proper sauna. And there was only one other person in there, one other guy, and he was up in the back on a sort of a shelf, and I squinted, and I realized it was Paul McCartney. So now I'm in a sauna. I'm this little kid from this Connecticut suburb, and I'm in a sauna with David Bowie and Paul McCartney. And they couldn't, I was just throwing water on the rocks, and we're shooting the bull. And they wanted to know things like, Paul McCartney wanted to know things like, what is MTV? They're really deep questions. But that remained to be one of my great stories all my years there. I mean, I had a lot of encounters with all kinds of artists, film stars and so forth. But that was a piece of serendipity. And the campaign was a success. And when people used to call us up and said, I want to do that, I want my MTV campaign. Various artists would want to be in it, so that saved us.
Yeah, you changed, huge music superstars emerged thanks to MTV. We forget, the bio doesn't do justice in terms of the characters and the brands you helped develop, including Jon Stewart, Dave Chappelle, Colbert, Jimmy Kimmel, Bill Maher, SpongeBob, SquarePants, the Beavis and Butthead, South Park, in addition to all the movies, because he also led Paramount Pictures. Looking back, and some of these characters are still very prominent in the United States and beyond. What are the things that you're most proud of in that period?
Well, we developed a whole suite it was sort of what India went through in the 90s here with cable. We developed a whole suite of these specialized channels. We had Nickelodeon for kids. We had Nick at Night, which was sort of a takeoff on classic television. We had Comedy Central, which was a comedy channel. We had a country music channel. We had something called VH1, which was an adult music channel. So we had a whole range of things that was like, I thought I had the perfect job. All the things I loved were in one place: animation, movies, music, and so forth. And I would say one of the things I'm most proud of these days even is Comedy Central. Because one thing we were always great at was finding new talent, talent that was coming up and coming. And if you were in the States, you might know some of these names, that all these people got a start on Comedy Central, starting from Bill Maher, Jimmy Kimmel, Jon Stewart, Stephen Colbert, the South Park guys, Dave Chappelle. I could go on, John Oliver. And in the 60s, during the Richard Nixon Vietnam War era, the resistance was sort of led by, rock and roll bands. And various pop stars would lead the charge against the war and against Nixon. Now in the age of Trump, which is actually much worse, we don't hear much from musicians. But that range of comedians who I just mentioned, most of whom had gone on to be late-night TV hosts or superstars on the concert circuit, they're really the front line of resistance to the Trump administration. And they've been tried to be thrown off the air, and people rally behind them. And I just feel very proud that they all got to start with us.
We'll get back to Trump in a bit, but
I hope not.
Tell us more about what when you returned to India as the head of MTV, and and again, the 90s was transformative for the Indian entertainment industry. Tell us more about the cable business in India and how it changed this country.
Yeah, and starting in the late 80s, countries outside the U.S., Europe, and then Asia in the early 90s began to deregulate television. So cable and satellite became very popular, which opened up a whole world for people like us. And because of my years in India, and Afghanistan, I developed a confidence that we can, you could kind of go anywhere and do anything, and things were really possible. I wanted us to be a leader. We really made MTV the first international television network. We had 50 different versions of it in various languages. And happily for me, we came in the mid-90s to India. India had become like the Wild West of television markets. Everybody wanted to be in India. Rupert Murdoch, who had entrepreneurs locally like Subhash Chandra and ZTV, and it all started with these cable operators after the Gulf War running cable down the street, and these guys used to carry, I thought the U.S. cable operators were bad, that the first people who ran the Indian cable systems were like gangster types. They carried guns. They bring guns to our office, and we would do deals with them. But in any event, we started MTV India first, and it really, of all of the different versions that we had, is the one I was most proud of. First of all, I was just happy to be back in India, but creatively, it really led the way. It came around in India at just the right time. There was a huge youth market that had been largely silent, that had a lot to say, and MTV India gave them a voice, gave them a platform. It was able to take music, Hindi, rock, and other types of music beyond Bollywood music and make it very popular. And what we found was that young Indians really had a voice. Instead of sort of mindlessly aping Western culture, they became very proud of their own. And at the heart of that was the fact that the channel had a sense of irreverence and ease and humor to it. And it became a network that not only was very successful in India, but also a lot of the things that they developed were pushed out, and we ran them on channels in Africa. They had shows that that were developed here that ran on the U.S. and everywhere. So they used to have a slogan in their offices in what was then Bombay, as made famous in India. And I think Alex Kuruvilla, who's out here somewhere today, he ran it. There he is. We were lucky enough to have Alex run the show for a while, as he went on to run Condé Nast Traveler, Vogue magazine, Condé Nast Traveler, the whole Condé Nast empire. And my dear friend Cyrus Oshadar, who is our creative director, created a lot of
worked with us.
Huh?
And then worked with us.
I convinced him to go to Afghanistan during the what they call now the American occupation, to work at Tolo TV. He was brilliant. We had a show called Bakra, which was like a hidden camera show that really became a huge hit. So that was the story.
I used to watch MTV and VH1 in Uzbekistan in the mid-90s with all the Bhangra music and Hindi rock, and I think it really changed things. Just not in India, but the entire region.
It really greatly enriched the music scene in India and gave a platform for a lot of music that wasn't really getting heard, besides Bollywood music, which ultimately we incorporated into our format as well.
So then in 2007 or 8, you're the CEO of Viacom, one of the largest media companies. You get fired for not buying MySpace by Sumner Redstone. And then you have your third life. And tell us about that. You returned to Afghanistan.
Well, I spent 26 years at MTV Networks, which was part of a company called Viacom. I just kind of rose through the ranks, eventually became the CEO of Viacom, which included Paramount Pictures, Simon & Schuster, who's represented here. My book actually is, ironically, on Simon & Schuster, one of their imprints. But I had this boss named Sumner Redstone, who was this cranky billionaire, a real character, but he fired me one day. That was the last thing I was expecting. You work at a place really long and you're doing really well, your radar kind of dims, and I didn't notice that there were some other people who would have preferred I wasn't in the company, so I got fired for not buying this social media thing called MySpace, which, turned out to be a nightmare anyway for the people Rupert Murdoch, who did buy it. And I decided I didn't want to get another job at a big company. I'd already sort of done that. I always was looking to do something that was interesting with interesting people, so I started a third life third career, I should say. I signed up to work with Bono from U2 to run his anti-poverty organization that focused on Africa. I worked with Oprah Winfrey. But best of all, and what took the most time, was I worked with this man. Saad Mohseni brought me back to Afghanistan. He was the first person to start a commercial television or radio station in Afghanistan, and that happened after the fall of the Taliban, when the country was dying to connect and dying for some form of entertainment and dying for some form of news and dying to be connected to the world. And his company, Moby, had two first channels. One was called Tolo, was in Dari, and one was called Lamar, which was in Pashto. They had built into their platform the idea of purposeful social change, gender equality, encouraging women to have families that have their kids in school, a lot of good, healthy things, very aspirational programming. So I went back and worked for them, and it was like perfect circle for me. It was sort of like the early days at MTV, which was a lot of young men and women working together, creating something totally new with a great sense of purpose, people who would have kept those jobs and worked at them for half the salary they were getting paid, which wasn't a lot. And I could say that, and others have said this, that the impact that Saad's business had within that country in that 20-year period was probably more impactful than the $2 trillion that America wasted on the military there through a series of, mistakes only America can make. So I would go back and forth from New York to Kabul, and I was really energized and loved this work. I brought Cyrus Oshadar back to help mentor and teach people. I had another friend from Chile who I knew from MTV Latin America, brought him back, and Saad had brought in various television professionals from Australia and created a network which there was 100 television stations in Afghanistan. As an unsung success of that period was independent media. And what became 3 channels with an all-news channel commanded like a 78% market share, the lion's share of the market, 250 advertisers. That was...
Thank you, Tom. You're very kind.
I mean, and whoever knew, they started a football league, and with all kinds of teams, because this was a country that had no heroes, and a lot of really purposeful work. And it's all over now.
Well, not quite.
Not quite. You can tell them what's still going on.
We're still going. No, I think we're running out of time, so I want to see if anyone's got any questions. We've got 10 or so minutes. But thank you, Tom. That was very kind of you.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation. If you could go back and speak today to your 22 or 23-year-old self, what would you tell that person?
I would say take some chances with your life. Don't follow the crowd. Get off that conveyor belt that kind of takes you through school, high school, college, assuming you go to college, and getting right out of college and taking a job. Mix it up a bit and go out and see the world if you can. The world isn't as free as it was when I was traveling around in the 70s, but there's still plenty of places to go. It's still the world's greatest classroom. It's good to stand in other people's shoes and see your country from afar. You never know what kind of doors are going to open to you along the way. And do that, and be able to embrace uncertainty and think that uncertainty is great, and don't be afraid to improvise a bit. That would be don't follow the crowd. That would be my advice.
One thing I have to say about Tom is that he's probably one of the most curious individuals I've met. He's constantly on the move, exploring, traveling, and so forth. Anyone else? Over there at the back, yeah.
Hi, from a New Yorker who lives in Delhi. I can't wait to read your book. I loved MTV. I miss MTV. And I blame reality TV for killing MTV. I'm wondering if you could comment on the rise of reality TV and what that's meant for society.
Reality TV. We started it. I'm sorry what it led to. we decided, like in the late 80s, we needed to stretch out a bit. And the creative people wanted to stretch out a bit, and we couldn't just play music videos back to back. But what if we took 10% of our time, that's 16 hours a week out of 168, and talked about some of the things music was about, fashion or films or politics. And then we had this new network that Rupert Murdoch and this guy Barry Diller started that was also going after young people, and they had these soap operas, Beverly Hills 90210, a couple of things like that. So we said, well, young people like to, let's do a soap opera, let's try that out. And they came to me, and it turned out that we couldn't really afford it. We had to pay writers. We didn't have that kind of money. We were good at post-production. So we said, what if we got 7, 8 kids and put them in a loft together, live together, and we have hidden cameras, and then we would make this into episodic television. And it was called The Real World. And these were people who had no idea what they would turn. They all turned out to be celebrities themselves. It was hugely popular. And it led to, I think it was still on the air. They've had, I don't know how many different versions of it. But then we did the Osbournes. We did sort of celebrity reality show. One day Sharon Osbourne said that, if anyone followed around me and Ozzy, it'll be a mind blower and see how we live our lives. So that was it. That was like green lit in like 1 minute.
Thanks for that, Tom.
Yeah, now
great job.
Unfortunately, it's ended up with The Apprentice and Donald Trump. But in that sense, we have something to answer for.
Yes, you do. Any more questions? At the back there, the lady at the very back.
Hi. Why the title From MTV to Timbuktu? The title of your book.
Why the title from MTV?
Why the title? Unplugged was a show we had on MTV, so I ripped that off. And then the book's really just a series of stories. I didn't know what, so some of these take place in one day, some over a few days. And I ended up, there's a whole story in the end about going to Timbuktu, which I won't tell you now, but...
you got to buy the book. You got to buy the book.
Yeah, if you buy the book, you'll find out. There's one...
one at the front, actually, yeah.
Is this, okay. Hello. Obviously, you were speaking about how media can be used as a form of connecting different people. Oh, sorry. Should I just... Hello. So you mentioned before that media can be used as a tool to connect people, but I wonder what you think about, because I think there's unfortunately an argument to be made that media causes quite a lot of disconnect nowadays with platforms sort of like TikTok and for the music world, Spotify, which means people are less likely to go out and see live music. So I wonder if you could, what your perspective is on that sort of transition and whether or not we can come back to using it as a tool for connection.
But how people are disconnected from TV and social media and so forth.
Yeah, well, I was there for what we used to call the cable TV revolution. That's been sort of supplanted then by the digital revolution. And the minute that someone could say get a music video on the internet on demand really fundamentally changed our business. And then social media, which was the next leg up, we're now, all of this presented huge challenges, not just for MTV, but for anybody who was in the traditional television business, because now everything's on demand. There's streaming services. One streaming service is Spotify. Basically, you get every song ever made. Is up in the cloud at your fingertips. So it's hard. It's been hard for MTV to. They were really slow on the draw in trying to reinvent themselves, I would say. And I don't know that it's impossible that they could come back in some kind of new digital configuration. But I'm out of it now, and they have new owners, and hopefully they're going to take the assets that they have and figure out a clever new way to come back. Because the music market itself is huge. The amount of music that's consumed is huge, and it's hard to believe that someone wouldn't want to garnish some corner of it for something that's carefully curated, where there's some conversation, and where they can get exposed to new music in basically every country in the world. So we had it good while it lasted.
Okay, well, actually, there's a question there, I think. Yeah.
Yes. Hi. My wife's pop star career was created by MTV in the mid-90s, so thank you for that. But as a follow-on from the previous question, I suppose the big bear in the room is AI and entertainment and talent. And how do you see that moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, no one knows the answer to that yet. But you do read of these AI recordings that there was a country music single that was AI generated that rose to the top of the charts, which is kind of shocking. I don't know where that all ends up. And now you have these AI operations sort of vacuuming up all this IP and reusing it without necessarily clearing rights to do so. So there's a whole legal thing that has to happen. But, and maybe this is an older person talking, but I just can't believe that people are still going to want a pop star like your wife was, a real human being, some authenticity, someone they can relate to, that isn't something coming out of some computer-generated, maze of bots. I don't know, maybe I'm being optimistic, but I believe there's always going to be room, particularly because of live entertainment and the desire for people to get together and enjoy something communally, for musical artists to be real. That's just my point of view.
Amen. We have time for one more. I think there's a lady at the back. 5 minutes? Okay. One more at the back.
Hi. I just wondered, in writing your memoir, what did you hope that people will get out of reading it? What's your main kind of message with it?
Well, I never meant to write one, first of all. And then the pandemic came along. I had a little time on my hands, so I started writing this. And I was wondering, how could all the seemingly disparate parts of my life come together? Could there be any kind of cohesive story? And there was. And I led a life that basically was like, I chose not to go down the middle of the road. I found that life on the side of the road was a little more interesting. I found that if you over-planned your life, maybe it wasn't as productive as sort of improvising, think of yourself as sort of a jazz bebop artist rather than some classical orchestra. And that's worked for me. And I just wanted to convey the message, particularly to young people, that you can invent your own life. You still can do that. You don't have to rely on what everybody else is doing. And you could be very surprised by how successful you might be if you do veer off to the side of the road where life is more interesting. And maybe you meet more interesting characters. And maybe more doors will open to you that you never could have imagined when you were 20 or 21 years old. Take risks.
B? Yeah.
I was really struck by your observation that it formerly was rock stars who led the opposition to political tyranny or to war in events, and that has now moved on to the late night TV hosts, and I'm sure that's not what they signed up for, but here we are. And I just wonder, in this era of increasing political horror of the landscape that we're currently in, whether you feel that creatives, be they musicians or writers, have a responsibility to resist or to, at the very least, comment on politics.
Well, that's a tricky question. For some artists, that is the case. Some artists just want to be a pure pop artist and, sing a song that was made by somebody in Sweden and put it out on Spotify. But you do see some of there's a few artists like Bruce Springsteen or Eminem, people who do stand up and make a stance. Most artists would be, I wouldn't say from the left side of the ledger, but they're certainly not fans of authoritarian rule. Their music alone is all about liberation and freedom. I wish more people would stand up. I don't understand why they don't. I don't understand that there's a huge price to pay. I think maybe to the contrary. The fact that comedians are doing this and doing it effectively and nothing bad's happening to them should be a signpost for more artists to speak up. Because what we're seeing now gets crazier by the day. It's total insanity.
Thank you for that. I think we've run out of time. This is Tom's book. Do yourselves a favor, buy a copy. I think he's signing some books after this talk. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Great to be here at LitFest.